Close your eyes for a sec and think of the word punk. What sort of images pop up in your mind? I think we all have some sort of image that we think of when we think of punk music. Leather jackets, studs and mohawks, loud, fuzzy, aggressive music. Maybe you can go on Pinterest or TikTok and you see rows and rows of song suggestions or outfit inspos. But if you take a look at these images, do those strike you as punk? Working class struggle, anti-establishment politics, a do-it-yourself mentality. This is the bread and butter of the punk community. A community that refused to submit to the mainstream, whether they're music labels or authoritarian governments.
Aku nulis liriknya itu dari cerita-cerita tongkrongan gitu, dan banyak ya teman-teman ketika lagi demo di jalanan atau cerita-cerita kayak putus cinta atau berantem sama pacar gitu, atau gimana ya, kan kalau anak muda itu ada kenakalan remaja, bagaimana menghadapi police brutality dan lain-lain gitu.
So, let's go into the history of punk music and its scene in Indonesia, how it grew alongside and galvanized political movements, and how it's still a space that bolsters the marginalized. Okay, to be honest, even my first interaction with the punk scene was as a sort of aesthetic, or a genre first and a subculture second, especially since punk music has sort of entered the mainstream by the 21st century. Still, it's important to understand the political backdrop that early punk music was born into. Many trace the origins of punk music to the 1970s and 80s US and UK, with rising stars like the Ramones, the Sex Pistols. The music that was being produced was visceral and unapologetic. The venues were small and grungy clubs and pubs, and this style arose from the cultural context these artists found themselves in.
The philosophy of being punk, what's it about, Donovan?
It's a rebellion against the old system that we were born into and we're supposed to live by. But we don't agree with today's system, so we rebel against it in our appearance, the way we dress, and the way we think, mainly.
Many of these artists, particularly in the UK, were facing rising inequality, austerity, and the privatization of public services.
It's because it's music made by people that feel an oppression and a depression. And it's exactly the same reason they're singing, because they can't get no work, they can't get this, and the only way they can get it across to the media is to sing about it and cause havoc the way they do.
Initially, they were funneling their frustration at a music industry who wouldn't welcome artists without money or connections and were starting to sound homogenized. But soon the community also turned its attention to politicians and law enforcement, who seemed to serve the interests of the rich and the powerful instead of the people.
My first impression dulu waktu itu masih kecil ya, kayaknya umur 16 tahun atau 15 tahun gitulah. It's really freeing. It's so nice to be able to get angry on stage and lashing out a lot of big energy, aggressive energy on stage, and people are also doing the same thing.
So that context of political turmoil and inequality was not unlike Indonesia in the 1990s. Where under the New Order government, both political speech and artistic expression was being reined in. Researcher Franz Adi Prasetyo recounts how in the 90s, the punk scene was growing in the city of Bandung. Small bands who were being gatekept from performing at concerts started their own gigs and started distributing their own music. Ironically, despite their confrontational music and aggressive demeanor, punk scenes were also communities. The lack of money and industry connections meant that punk artists relied on each other, on independent labels and zines and words of mouth. Both in the West and in Indonesia, the venues were small and the equipment was whatever the artists could scrounge up themselves.
Kalau di FKK itu adalah kayak the stage is the ruin. I think it was supposed to be kayak terasan rumah orang gitu. Cuma kan karena rumahnya udah hancur, jadinya cuma kayak batako-batako aja gitu. Terus di situ speakernya seadanya, mixernya yang mixer kecil gitu loh, bukan mixer yang kayak mixer konser yang segede gaban gitu loh. Terus monitor speaker tuh kayaknya nggak ada deh. Jadi kita nggak bisa terlalu dengar ya di panggung. Kita cuma bener-bener ngandelin feeling sama speaker utama, yang mana sebenarnya susah ya kalau dalam teknis ngeband, apalagi untuk drummer gitu.
You see, it didn't matter if the music wasn't polished. What mattered was that the music was true to yourself. The punk scene valued authenticity and a do-it-yourself attitude. John Holstrom, the founding editor of Punk magazine, said, "Punk rock was rock and roll by people who didn't have very many skills as musicians, but still felt the need to express themselves through music." And I think this drive to be uncompromisingly authentic is also what makes the punk scene home for the fearlessly political.
Organizer paling politikal yang pernah nge-booking kita tuh dulu adalah FKK ya di Bandung, Festival Kampung Kota. Karena di situ adalah sebuah festival di sebuah lahan di Taman Sari. Kalau teman-teman tahu, Taman Sari itu kan sekarang udah digusur, tapi dulu dia adalah perumahan yang udah terbangun selama beberapa dekade. Tiba-tiba dapet kayak surat dari pemerintah bahwa tempat ini harus digusur karena orang-orang penduduknya memakai lahan negara tanpa izin. Terus akhirnya udah ada sebagian daerah yang digusur. Nah di situ akhirnya teman-teman pada ikut turun ke jalan kan, teman-teman Taman Sari Melawan, teman-teman Kolektiva dan lain-lain. Akhirnya dibuatlah ruin dari yang sudah pernah dihancurkan itu jadi art space. Teman-teman kita bikin kayak pameran di ruins itu, bikin gigs di ruins itu, bikin bazar di ruins itu, dan mengajak keluarga setempat untuk juga menghidupkan tempat itu supaya nggak jadi digusur gitu.
Whether you're rallying around the homogenization of the music industry or economic inequality, punk is about community in the face of injustice. And under an authoritarian government, injustice is everywhere. A lot of the sources that I read seem to view the underground heavy metal scene as the point of entry for the Indonesian punk scene. Heavy metal, hardcore, and punk had a large following amongst Indonesian students in the 1990s. The same students who poured into the streets in 1998 demanding the end of President Suharto's 32-year-long reign. So much like their English cousins, the punk scene in Indonesia is inseparable from activism and anti-establishment politics. For almost 3 decades, there was only one TV channel in Indonesia, and it was government-run. Radios only played local hits or occasionally Billboard hits from abroad. So if the state wouldn't allow the kids to rock out to the music that they liked, they would do it themselves.
In Jakarta, it's amounted to an uprising of the urban poor, with people suffering from the worst economic crisis in decades ransacking shops and stores.
And after 3 decades of dictatorship, the country was facing an economic crisis, separatist conflicts, and race riots. if the state wouldn't care for its people, then these kids would do it themselves.
The atmosphere was buzzing with rumours and anticipation that this might be the end of the leader they feared and despised. But no one was prepared to believe that Suharto was gone until the words finally fell from his lips. I have decided to declare that I cease being the President of the Republic of Indonesia.
So the student protests of 1998 successfully brought down Suharto's regime, but the corruption and the oligarchical tendencies of his 3-decade-long reign persisted. But you know what? The punk scene also persisted. The issues that plagued the country may have changed over time, but that spirit of community in the face of injustice stayed the same.
Nah dari situlah dengar cerita kayak si A kemana ya? Oh si A ini nih tangkap polisi gitu. Oh gara-gara apa? Gara-gara paket nyasar. Ada yang ngirim dari polisinya sendiri. Tahu-tahu digerebek kayak gitu-gitu loh. Terus abis itu ada cerita lagi yang kayak si B kemana ya si B gitu. Iya dia lagi sakit di rumah gak bisa nongkrong. Kenapa? Soalnya kemarin ikutan demo Kamisan. Atau waktu itu ada demo apa ya zaman-zaman pandemi tuh yang kayaknya reformasi di korupsi deh. Iya kena gas air mata gini-gini, dikejar polisi, digebukin, kayak gitu loh.
Of course this kind of activism will be welcome in the punk scene. Why wouldn't it be? It's speaking truth to power. These artists wouldn't be pushed around by the music industry, so why would they just stand there while communities around them are being pushed around by the government? And it's also important to address that despite the progress it has brought about, the punk scene is still lacking in some regards. Paradoxically, even as the punk scene has created and in some cases galvanized change and created safe spaces for people who oppose the norm, who feel excluded from society, it's still a deeply masculine space. Female and trans performers are regarded as pioneers and not necessarily the norm. And gigs can still be places where discrimination and even harassment take place.
Dan untuk skena punk yang aku lihat dari jauh nih kan ya masih male dominated sih. Kebanyakan malah teman-teman queer aku yang sekarang aku temui nih, my everyday people gitu, agak cukup takut untuk pergi ke gigs punk karena itu masih male dominated. Adanya teman-teman queer aku tuh malah lebih suka pergi ke klub karena merasa lebih aman gitu. Sedangkan kalau pergi ke gigs punk itu kan ya ada yang namanya moshing gitu kan. Kalau misalnya kita ketemu teman-teman yang transfobik gimana gitu kan. Kita beneran bisa kayak digebukin di situ gitu.
But as Karina goes on to say, punk is about standing up for the excluded and the marginalized. Punk is standing up for small communities when the government tries to evict them off their land. And punk is certainly about creating safe spaces for the queer community to express themselves.
I think it only makes sense kalau misalnya trans people are being included in the punk scene as well. Karena operasinya sama beratnya gitu, bahkan mungkin lebih berat untuk teman-teman dengan gender yang tidak binary gitu. It would be like really empowering if we can share this frustration together in that case, you know. Apalagi kalau misalnya teman-teman di punk scene itu cukup aktif dengan pergerakan aktivisme jalanan, pergerakan diskusi-diskusi anarkisme gitu yang.
So despite the challenges that it's facing, the punk scene still remains the perfect vehicle for discussing gender norms and breaking them. Because like Karina says, it's more than the music. It's also the attitude.
I mean, you can see a punk attitude also in a rapper, for instance. Kayak banyak rapper-rapper yang bikin lirik sangat real sama kehidupannya yang susah. Menurut aku itu udah punk. Yang mana sama juga nih kayak teman-teman di queer scene, teman-teman queerku yang selalu kayak berusaha untuk jadi dirinya sendiri, yang berusaha untuk kayak selalu bodo amat sama apa kata standar sosial, terutama bagaimana kita sehari-hari direpres secara sistematis gitu sama negara sendiri, sama hukum yang kita gak tahu hak kita apa, bahkan malah yang kita tahu hak kita dibahayakan oleh negara gitu, diancam oleh negara sendiri gitu.
So yeah, maybe we do live in a time where punk is in danger of becoming just an aesthetic, a style that can be commercialized, but the punk attitude, being authentic and speaking truth to power, of forming community in the face of injustice, that lives on in the punk scene, among those who take pride in breaking the norms and who shamelessly embody lives lived on the margins of the status quo.